December 20th, 1944. The bitter cold of winter had settled across the American heartland. Frost clinging to the fences, fields and barns of rural towns that seemed untouched by the war-raging oceans away. Yet here, deep in the countryside of states like Iowa, Texas and Minnesota, an extraordinary encounter was about to unfold. Behind barbed wire fences, thousands of German prisoners of war were housed in camps scattered across the United States. Captured during battles in North Africa and Europe, these young men, once enemies sworn to destroy America, now stood face to face with the very people whose sons fought against them. But instead of violence or hatred, something unexpected began to happen. Farmers struggling to harvest crops during wartime shortages needed help. And so, the government allowed POWs to work in the fields. What began as a practical solution soon became a remarkable, secret chapter of humanity in the midst of global conflict. In the barns and orchards, on the vast wheat fields and corn rows, German POWs labored side by side with American farmers. Over time, guarded suspicion gave way to cautious exchanges, then to conversations, laughter, and even friendship. These men, divided by nations and uniforms, discovered something profoundly human in their shared labor and shared hunger for peace. This story, hidden from the headlines of war, reveals how bonds were quietly forged across enemy lines. It is a story of trust born in the soil, of secret kindness in times of bitterness, and of humanity surviving where least expected. This is the story of when German POWs became friends with American farmers. The war was at its height, but life in America's countryside carried on with a rhythm both familiar and strained. The year was 1944. And while the thunder of artillery shook Europe, the rolling farmlands of the Midwest, the South, and the plains still echoed with the creak of wagons, the lowing of cattle, and the steady hum of tractors. Yet beneath this surface of routine lay a tension that every American farmer felt deeply. There were simply not enough hands to work the land. With so many young men gone to the battlefront, sons, brothers, farmhands, the burden fell on aging parents, exhausted mothers and children far too young for such grueling labor. Corn rotted in the husk because no one could harvest fast enough. Wheat spoiled in the sun. Orchards, once bursting with promise, stood neglected as families worked themselves to collapse. In those fields of desperation, a strange and unlikely solution arrived. Men who had once fired rifles in the name of the Third Reich. They came not by choice, but by capture. From the deserts of North Africa to the shattered villages of France, German soldiers had been taken prisoner by advancing Allied troops. By 1943, ships were already ferrying them across the Atlantic. By the war's end, nearly 500,000 German POWs would live behind fences on American soil. Their camps sprouted in unlikely places. Sleepy towns in Texas, rural Nebraska, the heartlands of Minnesota, and countless other regions where locals had never seen a foreign soldier before. For many Americans, the thought of enemy soldiers living so near was unsettling. Fear mingled with bitterness. After all, how could anyone forget Pearl Harbor, the Blitz, or the letters arriving weekly from Europe announcing another son killed in combat? Yet war has a way of creating paradoxes, and here was one of the strangest. Farmers who resented the enemy soon found themselves working shoulder to shoulder with them. The arrangement began quietly. The U.S. government realized the agricultural crisis at home was endangering food supply for civilians and soldiers alike. America needed wheat, corn and cotton as desperately as it needed tanks and planes. And so, under tight supervision, German POWs were trucked out of their camps and into the fields. At first, they were met with hard stares, even curses spat under the breath of farmers whose own sons wore American uniforms. Some farmers refused outright, unwilling to let the enemy touch their land. Others agreed only because their survival depended on it. The sight was surreal. Men in faded Wehrmacht uniforms, guarded by American soldiers with rifles, bending to pick crops under the same sun that scorched the brows of the farmers who once cursed them. But war has a way of peeling away illusions. The prisoners, most of them no older than the American boys fighting in Europe, were not monsters. They were tired, homesick, and hungry. Their calloused hands, like the farmers, had known plows and shovels long before they held rifles. Many were sons of farmers themselves, torn from fields in Bavaria, Saxony, or the Rhineland, thrown into uniforms and marched across continents in a war none of them had chosen to start. They carried with them photographs of mothers, letters from sisters, and memories of seasons long past. And as they bent over American soil, under skies so much like their own back home, something quietly began to stir, a recognition that the man beside them, though an enemy, was also a mirror. At first, words were scarce. Few Americans spoke German, and fewer prisoners spoke English. Communication was limited to gestures, nods, and the universal language of labor. A farmer might point to a wagon, and a prisoner would haul it. A hand motion toward a plow was met with action. Slowly, awkwardly, words were exchanged. Broken English, fractured German, laughter over mispronunciations. A farmer's wife might cautiously bring out a jug of water, or a child might stare wide-eyed at these strange men who looked so ordinary despite their uniforms. And gradually, invisible walls began to crumble. One story from Texas tells of a farmer who, after weeks of working alongside the prisoners, discovered one of them could play the harmonica. One evening after supper, the German was permitted to sit on the farmhouse porch and play. The tune was haunting, a folk song from the old country, and though no one in the family understood the words, they felt the ache of longing in every note. The farmer's wife wiped her eyes quietly. Music, it seemed, had crossed a line that politics could not. From that night, the prisoners were treated differently, not as nameless captives, but as young men with hearts, dreams, and talents. In Iowa, an elderly farmer later recalled how he had been skeptical, even hostile, when German prisoners first arrived to work his fields. But as the weeks passed, he began to notice the discipline and care with which they labored. One prisoner, he said, fixed a broken piece of farm equipment without being asked, using skills learned back in Germany. The farmer, struck by the gesture, offered him a cup of coffee, the first real act of kindness between them. Years later, he would admit that moment changed something inside him. He could no longer see the prisoner as an enemy, only as a fellow human being caught in the machinery of war. The friendships that blossomed were never supposed to happen. The U.S. government strictly forbade fraternization. Farmers were warned not to feed or befriend the prisoners beyond what was necessary. But life is not lived in rules and regulations alone. Hunger and exhaustion tend to break barriers, and long days under the sun bring people together in ways official orders cannot prevent. A farmer might quietly slip a prisoner an extra piece of bread, or a child might offer an apple. Prisoners, in return, would sometimes carve toys from wood scraps or craft trinkets as gifts, gestures of gratitude for small mercies. These exchanges were not just acts of kindness. They were acts of quiet rebellion against the hatred the war demanded. The seasons passed, and with each harvest the bonds grew stronger. In some cases, farmers trusted prisoners enough to work without guards watching every step. The men who had once been feared began to look like older brothers to children, or like neighbors lending a hand. And though the war raged on overseas, in these quiet fields peace was being rehearsed. It was peace built on sweat, soil, and the realization that humanity could endure even when nations clashed. As the months stretched on, the strangeness of war and captivity gave way to the rhythm of daily life, and what had begun as labor born of necessity became something more deeply human. The farmers and their families, hardened by years of sacrifice, began to see the prisoners not only as workers, but as companions in their struggle. The landscape itself seemed to encourage it, vast skies arching over endless fields, the kind of silence that settles only in rural towns, where gossip spreads slower than corn tassels in summer, but lingers longer than the frost. It was in those silences, in the pauses between toil, that gestures of trust appeared like fragile green shoots after winter. A farmer's wife, leaving out fresh biscuits on a fence post, knowing the prisoners would pass by. A young German soldier quietly repairing a broken hinge on a barn door. The smallest actions carried immense weight because they defied the war's command to hate. It was never easy. Suspicion still hovered in the background, like the shadow of a storm cloud on a summer afternoon. Many Americans had lost loved ones in the war. Sons killed at Anzio, cousins buried in Normandy, fathers swallowed by the Pacific. Letters bearing the government seal arrived in mailboxes with the kind of finality that breaks families forever. For those people, the presence of German soldiers, even as captives, was a bitter reminder of grief. Some farmers refused to look prisoners in the eye. Some wives would never allow their children near them. There were whispers in town meetings, suspicions that fraternization was not only dangerous but treasonous. And yet, even with those fears, there were farmers who could not ignore the humanity standing beside them, sweat-soaked, sunburned, and often smiling despite their situation. Humanity, when encountered face to face, has a way of breaking down the abstract walls of propaganda. The Germans, too, found themselves changed. For many, their first impressions of America had been shaped by Nazi propaganda that painted the United States as a decadent, brutal, and soulless land. But what they discovered on farms and in small towns defied every lie they had been fed. They encountered families who lived simply but worked with quiet dignity. They saw children attending one-room schoolhouses, farmers rising before dawn, mothers preserving jars of fruit in kitchens filled with warmth and care. For young men who had grown up under the rigid grip of Hitler's Germany, the freedom and openness of rural America was disorienting and alluring. Some prisoners later recalled that it was in those years of captivity, laboring on American soil, that they first glimpsed what democracy looked like, not in speeches, but in everyday life. One German recalled being struck by how American farmers spoke openly, sometimes even criticizing their own government or the war effort without fear of arrest. That kind of frankness would have been unthinkable back home. Another prisoner remembered being allowed into a farmhouse kitchen one stormy afternoon, when rain halted the day's work. The farmer's wife, after some hesitation, poured him coffee and offered a slice of pie. To him, that moment, simple, almost casual, was revolutionary. He had expected hostility, maybe even cruelty. Instead, he was treated as a human being, a guest at a table he never imagined he would sit at. He would later say that piece of pie changed his view of America forever. Of course, not all interactions were born of kindness. There were moments of conflict, suspicion, even cruelty. Some guards treated the prisoners harshly, reminding them constantly of their status as captives. There were scuffles, escapes attempted, punishments handed down. Yet even in those darker moments, the resilience of human connection shone through. Prisoners who tried to flee often returned voluntarily, hungry and exhausted, realizing they were treated better in captivity than they might be in freedom. Farmers who once swore they would never speak to an enemy found themselves defending the dignity of their prisoners against harsher guards. The lines between captor and captive blurred in ways that no one could have predicted. The seasons carved their marks on these bonds. In spring, they tilled the soil together, Germans handling plows with the same instincts they had learned in their villages back home. In summer, they sweated side by side beneath relentless suns, harvesting row after row of crops. Autumn brought the backbreaking labor of gathering wheat and corn, a flurry of activity that demanded trust and cooperation. And winter, long, biting and lonely, created moments of quiet companionship. In some camps, prisoners carved Christmas ornaments from wood scraps and gave them to the farmers' children. Farmers' wives sometimes slipped extra food into rations during the holidays. Against the backdrop of barbed wire and military discipline, moments like these glowed with a defiance that only compassion can sustain. There were letters too, smuggled notes, cautious exchanges of addresses. Though regulations forbade lasting contact, some farmers and prisoners dared to hope their connection could endure beyond the fences. After the war, many did. Letters traveled across oceans, between rural Nebraska and Bavarian villages, between Iowa barns and small towns along the Rhine. Some American families even welcomed former prisoners back years later as friends, no longer as enemies. And in those reunions, the memories of harvests shared and fences crossed were spoken of with the kind of reverence usually reserved for family stories. The story of these bonds was never grand, never written in the headlines or declared in speeches. It existed in small, quiet moments, in the sound of boots crunching soil, in the steam of a coffee cup shared across an invisible divide, in the laughter of a child who no longer cared what uniform a man wore. War demanded hatred, but the land, the labor, and the stubborn resilience of the human spirit nurtured something else entirely. These bonds, fragile yet profound, were the quiet victories of compassion that no general could claim and no battlefield could destroy. As the war edged toward its conclusion in 1945, the fields where German prisoners had labored were no longer just sites of necessity, but had become quiet stages where something almost sacred unfolded. Bonds that began as faint gestures of civility had, in many places, blossomed into trust and even affection. Yet with the end of the conflict approaching, a shadow grew over these relationships. The same trucks that had delivered the men to the farms would soon carry them away, not just back to their camps, but eventually across the ocean, back to a continent devastated by bombings, shortages, and grief. For many American farmers, this realization came with a surprising weight of sadness. The men they had once eyed with suspicion had become companions, sometimes even friends, and now those friendships were destined to dissolve under the tide of history. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. VE Day brought parades, cheers and tears of relief across America. But on the farms, the news came with a bittersweet note. For the farmers, it meant their sons and neighbors might soon return home. For the German prisoners, it meant repatriation, eventually to their shattered homelands. But in the liminal space between surrender and return, something remarkable occurred. Many farmers, unburdened by wartime propaganda now that the guns had fallen silent, began to openly express their gratitude to the men who had helped keep their farms alive. Some hosted quiet farewell meals, with prisoners seated at the family table, no longer watched over by guards. Stories survive of farmers' wives preparing pies, roasting chickens, or offering a simple handshake, gestures that, though small, carried profound meaning in the context of enemies turned companions. In those final weeks, the exchanges became bolder. Photographs were taken together. An American farmer in overalls, standing with a German prisoner in a patched uniform, both smiling as if the war were already a distant memory. Children clung to the legs of prisoners who had once carved them toys. Farmers passed along letters of recommendation or small parcels of food, knowing the journey home would be harsh. Prisoners, in turn, left behind carvings, hand-sewn trinkets, or carefully written notes of gratitude. One recalled writing, "I came here as a prisoner. I leave as a man who found kindness among strangers." Another wrote that he had discovered a different kind of America, not the enemy, but the land of open skies and open hearts. Yet, the partings were not easy. Trucks rumbled down dirt roads, carrying prisoners back to the camps, while farmers stood by fences, hats in hand, watching with a heaviness they could not quite name. Some men waved until the trucks disappeared. Others stood silently, the dust rising like a curtain between two worlds. The fields felt emptier afterward, though the crops still grew and the chores remained. What lingered was the memory of laughter, music, and shared labor, a memory that no amount of official silence could erase. For though the government discouraged fraternization, the reality in those small towns was that lives had intertwined in ways that could not be undone. When the prisoners finally returned to Germany, they carried with them not only the scars of war, but also the unexpected imprint of American farmland. Many came back to ruined villages, families struggling to survive, and futures uncertain. Yet in their stories, told to wives, children, and grandchildren, they often spoke of the time in America when enemies became something closer to friends. Some wrote letters across the Atlantic, maintaining fragile but enduring connections. A few even returned years later as immigrants, seeking the very soil where they had once worked as captives. For them, America was no longer just a distant adversary. It was a place where they had glimpsed dignity, compassion, and a shared humanity that transcended borders. For the American farmers, the memory lingered too. They carried it quietly, often unspoken, because war stories usually focused on battles, victories, and losses. But in their barns, over dinner tables, or in conversations decades later, they would recall the young German who fixed a tractor, the prisoner who played harmonica on the porch, the men who had laughed with them in the fields. They remembered the friendships formed not by choice, but by circumstance. Friendships that revealed how thin the line between enemy and neighbor can truly be. History tends to record wars in numbers, how many soldiers fought, how many bombs fell, how many died. But in those fields across America, history was written in smaller, quieter ways, in a shared jug of water, in the swing of a scythe, in the breaking of bread between supposed enemies. Those stories rarely made it into textbooks, but they lived on in the hearts of those who experienced them, shaping how they saw the world long after the war had ended. They remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, the seeds of understanding and compassion can still take root. Today, when one looks back at that period, it is tempting to see it as an anomaly, a curious footnote in the larger narrative of World War II, yet perhaps it was something more. Perhaps it was proof that even when nations clash, individuals can defy the logic of hatred. That on the edges of battlefields, in the quiet corners of life, ordinary people can create moments of peace that shine brighter than the war around them. The friendships between German POWs and American farmers did not end the conflict, nor did they alter the course of history in a dramatic way. But they revealed something essential, that the human spirit, when allowed to look beyond uniforms and propaganda, has an astonishing capacity for empathy. And so, in the story of those farmlands, of the prisoners who became companions, we find not only a historical curiosity, but a lesson that reminds us of the quiet power of kindness, the resilience of trust, and the possibility of friendship even in the unlikeliest of circumstances. It is a story that deserves to be remembered not just as a tale of war, but as a testament to the simple, stubborn truth that even in the shadow of global conflict, humanity endures.